Hania and Alfred, I thought you were going to say a few words of introduction, or do you want me to begin?
We will be starting with a video first.
Okay, fine. Good. Okay.
Okay, Hania, we're live now.
Okay, I'll start.
Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Welcome staff, students, and alumni of the Institute of Development Studies, as well as members of the development community, to the first ever TEDxIDS conference. My name is Hania Mattu. I am one of the co-lead organizers of this event and have just completed my master's from IDS. The TEDxIDS journey started at the beginning of this year when my co-lead Alfred reached out to me. IDS have such a strong community of students and alumni, and he was keen to highlight these voices and what they believed the future of the development space holds. After numerous discussions with our fantastic student organizing committee about what our theme should be, we narrowed in on building back better. Building back better has been a rallying cry for the development community for some time now. It is particularly important today, especially as the world builds back from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we would argue that it needs to go one step further, and there is a need to rethink how we approach development. This is why when we were putting together the program, we focused on the theme of building back better, but different. Each one of us has a different notion of what post-COVID development would look like, and this was incredibly apparent in the applications that we received from students who wanted to speak at the event. We have some great talks organized today from the IDS community. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat box and we will address them as the talks end. Also, you can follow the conversation online on our Twitter at TEDxIDS and follow our Instagram for some fun content, also at TEDxIDS. This event would not have been possible without the student organizing committee who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring this together. A special thank you as well to the IDS comms team who have supported us through this process, and to the IDS management who immediately jumped on board when we first pitched this idea to them. I'd now like to start the event with an address from the director of IDS, Melissa Leach. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So a warm welcome to everybody, and I couldn't be more delighted to be having the chance to say a few words at this first ever IDS TEDx event, all the more special because it's student-led by our fantastic student cohort. So thank you to all of you. And this is a TEDx about development and building back better, and it comes at a time when development is at a crucial juncture. I think it already was at a crucial juncture even before COVID-19 hit. And I want to just outline in these first few words some of the reasons why I think that was the case, and what COVID might mean about the opportunities to rethink development and build forward differently, even more fundamentally. So the world is facing a whole set of what are often called global challenges, whether we're talking about climate and environmental change, inequality and injustice of many kinds, whether across gender or race or place, digital disruptions, the effects of urbanization, ongoing poverty in many parts of the world. This already required transformations to get us to what I sometimes talk about as a kind of position of more equitable sustainability in the way our societies and economies operate. And of course, we are at this point, or at least earlier this year, we were only 10 years away from the deadline of the UN Global Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which in many ways embraced a number of these challenges and set every country in the world, Global North as called, as well as Global South, on a track supposedly to sign up to commitments to deliver on a different future, a future in which not just 17 goals and 169 targets might be delivered on, but actually in which those different agendas could come together in really quite a transformational package that would make a real difference. And I think we already knew that moving towards a kind of more equitable, sustainable world would involve challenging power relations, addressing and undoing old patterns, including unjust and often neoliberal world orders that uphold inequality and unsustainability, orders which have enabled some people, some businesses, some individuals, some groups to profit at the expense of others and often at the expense of our planet and non-human natures. And I think we already knew that transformational change of the kind we needed required challenges to old style mainstream development processes that privileged top-down planning and told people what to do as if kind of one size fitted all. But then along comes COVID-19 as an example of a really big shock and disruption. Not the first, not the only, coming on the tail of a whole set of disruptions and shocks, whether we're talking about the global financial crisis and economic shocks of 2008, or whether the shocks which many people around the world are feeling already in terms of climate and environment, or the shocks associated with conflict. And I think COVID, which in terms of epidemics has proved to be the long-awaited big one, a pandemic capable of bringing societies and economies to their knees, which it has done, is also a reminder that our world is constantly susceptible to shocks and to disruptions. So what does that mean? I think as we've seen with previous shocks, such as the global financial crisis, shocks can reinforce the powerful. This was really the thesis behind Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, where she looked at how the financial crisis, the war on terror had all given the opportunity for, frankly, powerful interests to reassert themselves, to profit, sometimes to become stronger in the process, at the expense of others, at the expense of people who had alternatives to offer. But there's also another view. There's another view of what shocks do, which is that they can open up, they can disrupt things in such a way as to create openings where they didn't exist before, into which new thinking and action can step. And this is, I think, the positive side of what we might be facing now with COVID-19. People, as they've said before around other humanitarian disasters, but even more now, are saying, can we use the COVID opportunity to not just build back better, but build forward differently? Or, as colleagues and I put it in a recent article, can we look towards post-pandemic transformations? So I think to do that, we have to reflect a little bit on what the COVID-19 pandemic is telling us about the way the world works. I think we're seeing through the way the pandemic originated, is unfolding and is having effects. We're seeing that questions of inequality, questions of vulnerability come to the fore. People say at one level, this pandemic is affecting everybody, but it's clearly not. It's affecting people very unequally across the lines of class, of place, of race, of gender. We're seeing the pandemic in a way reproducing some of the worst of the structural, political and economic conditions which have caused vulnerability in the past. And yet we're also seeing it as unfolding in ways that are not ordered. They're quite unruly. They reflect the complexity of our social relationships, our economic relationships. They reflect contingency. They reflect uncertainty, and they reflect context specificity. One size is not fitting all. Things are unfolding in quite unruly ways. And that combination of reminding us about structural political economy and pointing out uncertainty and unruliness, I think raises three really important challenges for development thinking in the broadest sense. The first is how evidence, science, advice are used in policy, when so often conditions are quite rigidly locked down to established power relations, and yet they're so uncertain. How can we give rise, how can we actually have a policy process that treats uncertainties with respect and works in that context? I think a second is some really big questions about how economies function. We were already facing big questions about the limits of conventional models of economic growth, conventional ways of measuring development in terms of GDP. And COVID has questioned all of those things, not least through the ways that informal kinds of economic organizing, community solidarities, ways of doing things differently, where enabling people to support their livelihoods, have revealed not just non-economic, but alternative solidarity economies and ways of working. And then I think the third big challenge and opportunity is around politics, and suggests that new forms of politics might become the basis of some reshaped relationships between citizens and states. What kind of new social contracts might we be seeing emerging in confronting a pandemic? It's not just about state regulation and authoritarian leaders asserting themselves, which is something we have seen, but also some really much more exciting, positive, emergent phenomena, like which are based much more around mutual solidarity and care. So I think those are three really big areas: the relationship between science advice and evidence and uncertainty, how I think rethinking economies, rethinking politics. And fundamentally, I think COVID demonstrates that actually we do face quite an uncertain future, where anticipation and resilience to major shocks probably has to become the core problematic of development studies and practice, and where mainstream approaches to development have often been quite top-down, they've been quite rigid, and they've been oriented towards quite narrowly defined goals, often economic ones. Post-COVID development, I think anyway, must have a much more radically transformative, egalitarian, justice-focused and inclusive knowledge and politics at its core. I think importantly, that also extends to relationships between countries and places, and the universality of the experience of COVID, or indeed perhaps a reversal where, unlike previous epidemics which have often emerged from Africa or Asia to threaten more established old industrial centers of power, in a way COVID has reversed that. Where are the countries that are experiencing things really, really badly and frankly not handling them very well? It's countries like the US and the UK. So there are some reversals there, which I think can really underpin what we now need in terms of a universal and decolonial approach to development that sees it as progressive change, which is relevant to everyone everywhere, but also constantly questions the assumptions and the power relations and the positionalities of all of those involved. So these are some of the sort of rethinks, resets that I think IDS was already trying to address including through the strategy we launched earlier this year, Transforming Knowledge, Transforming Lives, which tried to address the shocks and disruptions of our era through some really big commitments to tackling climate and environmental justice, to addressing extreme inequities, to building more inclusive democratic societies, and through addressing health and well-being. But also through some of the strategic priorities that we set then around helping to build new generations of leaders, championing evidence where it can really lead to social justice, and working through truly global networks and partnerships. I think that's what some of what we were already trying to do. I think doing this with our students and with our alumni who represent the critical next generation thought and action leaders in development is critical. And I think this TEDx event couldn't come at a more opportune time to enable us all to work together to build forward differently into a, I hope, truly transformative development era post-COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Now we're going to move on to our first talk. Terry Cannon is a senior research fellow at IDS, where he works on rural livelihoods and local adaptive responses to climate change. He also teaches the MSc Climate Change Development and Policy course at IDS. Other than IDS, he teaches at a number of other universities. In his talk, Terry addresses the issues of power and why the world is the way it is, and what it will take for development studies and aid to build back better, but different. He has been researching and teaching in development for 40 years with increasing frustration at what he believes is going wrong with it.
The world is the way it is because those who have power want it to be this way. A very simplistic statement, you might think. I've chosen it to explore some of my concerns about how aid and development studies are changing for the worse under current systems of power. Over the course, the phrase, those who have power, is shorthand for a complex set of interlocking and conflicting interests. But in different places and at varying scales, those with power have the ability to command systems that allocate resources, assets such as land and water, jobs, livelihoods and income. And these allocations are not natural or God-given, they are socially constructed. The ways that the powerful command these assets and income are designed to produce benefits for the minority. They are not an accident. The economically powerful also dominate systems of politics that legalize and legitimize these allocations and determine the rates of taxation that are usually low, and these can therefore not be used to support greater equity. These systems of power themselves are the reason there is much of the suffering in the world that development aid and research claims to be trying to fix. The way resources and incomes are allocated is the reason aid is supposedly needed to fix the problems caused by power. Forms of power include not only capitalism, which is often seen misleadingly in terms of the 1 or even the 10%, but it involves different kinds of power which affect hundreds of millions of people through semi-feudal systems of land tenure and other local power approaches. But power also involves conflicts of gender, ethnicity, caste, sexuality, age, and disability. Why would those who benefit from these systems be willing to give them up? Are we confident that development aid is trying to achieve things that would challenge those who have power, which is what would be required for real change? Would aid and research be different if we were not dependent on those who have power for funding? What would it take to really decolonize aid and development studies? Now, I fully realize that what I'm saying oversimplifies, but does it simplify away from the truth or in the direction of greater honesty? I think that many aid interventions have a very low potential for changing the ways that the powerful decide what happens in the world. Do we think that development interventions can somehow be neutral and not disturb the powerful? If what is done in the name of development is neutral to power, can it do much good? Are we confident, and are the funders confident, that after 10 years there will still be some evidence that what happened with the aid is still visible and having an impact? I want to test that. One of the things I want to come out of this talk is a project which I call 10 Plus the Development Checker, in which I hope we can develop a methodology which would involve lots of volunteers going to different project sites which finished around 10 years ago, and find out what evidence there is that those activities, those aid projects, actually existed. Now, of course, that's going to be a big challenge for the organizations that funded those activities, ranging down from the UN down to NGOs. But I think if they are honest about what they want to do in having an impact, then they would be open to the idea that this would be tested by the 10 Plus Development Checker. So if you're interested, do please make contact to see if we can set this up in the coming year. How can we build back better and different? Is it possible to build back better under existing systems of power? I argue that it is only possible to build back better if it is also different, where the systems of power are changed so that resources and incomes are distributed more fairly and oppression is reduced. That, of course, is not easy. Going against power is difficult and can be risky. What I'm really calling for is greater honesty, so that if the aid and research cannot be effective without changing power, then we must say so. If a problem such as hunger cannot be solved without changing the systems that cause hunger, we must say so. Can development studies help? Well, development aid claims to influence the way power is used to push back against some of the negative impacts. Development studies supposedly provides the research that both identifies who needs help and how it should happen. I believe that development research is increasingly avoiding analysing the causes of exploitation and oppression, because otherwise the funding wouldn't be available. We are embedded within systems of power that use aid for power. Development organisations do what they can do rather than what is needed by poor and oppressed peoples. How different would our ideas, our analysis and our behaviour be if we were not having to do it for and within our organisations? Development research organisations are even trying to increase their funding from billionaire philanthropists, tax evaders. People from the 1% who are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Can we always claim that we are investigating the real causes of the problem we are claiming to help to fix if we fall into these patterns? And do the standard claims made for our interventions to be effective, do they actually work? The kind of claims that we make, that we are participatory, grassrooted, community-based or community-led, involving local ownership, pro-poor, leaving no one behind, and using empowerment, empowering people. All of these buzzwords are deeply criticised. Some of the criticisms of them go back decades, but yet they still remain the standard ways by which we justify that things can work and be valid in terms of development interventions. I think we get sucked into using dev speak and jargon that fails to deal with root causes and instead enables the reason problems exist to be covered up. We are full of jargon words that rip meaning out of analytical research. Food security, governance, resilience, sustainable, transformation. For example, do we ever think about how long serious transformational change may take? Can it possibly happen in a development project that lasts 3 to 5 years? In Britain, votes for women took 100 years to achieve with great struggle. Ending exploitative feudal land tenure systems in much of Asia and Latin America may take years. I'll give an example of food security, which I think is a great example of terminology which has been ripped away from actually understanding the causes towards something which is not challenging to those causes because they're influenced by power. So we've moved from the idea of hunger. 30 years ago, we would have talked about hunger, not food security. People are hungry. People can't get enough to eat. Then the intervention of systems of power says, we need to introduce more, we need to produce more food. More food needs to be produced. So instead of it being an argument about how people have access to food, whether they can grow enough from their own land or have enough income to buy food, the answer to food is not analysing hunger and its causes, but producing more food. When we know that in many situations where people are hungry, it is not because there is a shortage of food. And so the argument goes from explaining hunger to actually the need for food security, which is a safe terminology, which does not involve looking at the systems of power that make people hungry. Development is embedded within existing systems of power and trying to push against them, but actually it's contaminated and distorted by those power systems in order to fit more comfortably within them. And it fails to adequately challenge them because they pay us. Development studies, including IDS and AID, were born from the colonial systems that subjugated much of the world until the 1970s. IDS recently celebrated, why would it celebrate its 50th anniversary instead of reflecting on why is it still necessary to have development research? I think that development research is now integrated into the bogus binary of developed, developing, global north, global south. I think this bogus binary disguises why people suffer in this world by pretending that there is something special or exceptional about each of these sets of countries. This overrides the understanding of the processes of exploitation and oppression which take place in all countries. Hunger in Britain may have different types of explanations than that of hunger in, say, India or Tanzania, but to assess them as if there are two types of countries, rather than analysing the causes of hunger wherever it happens to be, can be very misleading. Now, of course, the causes in India will not be the same as in Tanzania, and the causes of hunger in one part of India will not be the same as in another part of that country. But the value of having a developing and developed binary of two sets of countries is only useful for the convenience and the value of perpetuating the system of the more powerful countries wanting to use this bogus binary. Aid and development research becomes a way of perpetuating the idea that there are two sets of countries that are different. It becomes essentially neo-colonial because instead of examining why problems happen, wherever they happen, it assumes that one set of countries has the answers and the funding, and that these must be transferred from us to them. And this, in my view, disguises what are the causes of the problems and how those causes relate to the systems of power within which aid and development studies are themselves embedded. Thank you very much.
That was great, Terry. And decolonizing aid and development is key when looking to the future. Now, if anyone has any questions, again, please include them in the chat box. Terry is live with us right now, and he can address anything that you would like to hear about. I myself have a question for Terry, and it is about this binary between the North versus the South. How do we get past this?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I do apologize for my rigid delivery in that talk. It was, I was nervous saying quite a lot of things in a short space of time, so I'm very sorry that it was so rigid. How would you deal with that? I think that the issue, as I was trying to hint at, is to analyze problems wherever they happen. So, for example, if it was hunger, we would analyze what are the causes of hunger wherever it is that it exists. There's currently around 1 million households in Britain that get food from food banks. They cannot afford enough to eat. We should be analyzing this. Why do we think that it is useful to have two sets of countries in which one set of countries thinks that it has the answers to what should happen in the other set of countries? I think we should invite researchers from Africa to come to Britain to investigate hunger and homelessness. I mean, many of the students who arrive in Brighton are absolutely shocked that there are people living on the streets. Why are we not investigating these? So I think what we need is an institute for social studies, not an institute for development studies. And we do not have a distinction between the problems of inequality, oppression, and poverty wherever they exist. And once we start doing that, we notice that the systems of power that control and influence poverty and oppression in Britain are not that different from the systems of power which cause oppression and suffering in the so-called global south.
We have a few more. So Vanessa asks, how do we move forward within these systems of power if they are restrictive and covering up root causes of some of these global issues?
How do we move forward?
How do we move forward within these systems of power if they are restrictive, covering up root causes of some of these global issues?
That's what we have to find. I think it has to be based on campaigning, combined with research. And I think the Black Lives Matters movement and the Extinction Rebellion are examples of the kinds of movements which existed in the 19th century, which promoted things like votes for women, democracy, social housing, fairness in distribution of greater fairness distribution of income. I think that it's these movements of people pushing back against power, which is what's important. It's very doubtful whether research will influence policy, because as I said in the talk, why would those who implement policy be interested in changing the benefits they have from the power that they exercise? I don't have a magic answer. The key thing that I emphasized in the talk was to say that we have to be honest. If the problem of hunger in Tanzania is not solvable without changing the systems of power that might be influential in causing that hunger, then we have to say so. We don't pretend that our project for 3 years is going to solve that problem.
Thank you. Then next up, Fred is asking, whilst the binary developed might be problematic, would it not make sense to differentiate more between development studies and development aid?
Well, I can see that, because we can talk as being research. And I think when it started up, it was the function of institutes like IDS and ISS in the Netherlands and so on. It was the emergence of that provided research. But the research, as it started up in these institutions, was already based on the idea that there's a binary of we provide the model for what should happen in the other countries. Now, that has been critiqued. The critiques of what development means and development research means are there, which is why it is somewhat surprising that similar mistakes are made over and over again in terms of using the jargon that I was kind of illustrating. I think that in development studies, we are captured. We've been captured by policy. We are not providing evidence to change policy. We've been captured by policy to be integrated into the binary in a way where our research can no longer be autonomous or free of the influence of power. And that's why I used the example of food security as a very concrete example of how it has shifted from what we would have talked about 30 years ago of dealing with hunger into a situation where food security now is something which is strategic level, influencing United Nations systems, national government policies and so on, but it's had the of why hunger exists ripped out of it for the convenience of those who exercise power. So my problem about preserving development studies is that I think it's being captured, it's increasingly captured, and we are forced into using terminology and frameworks which do not encourage looking at the causes of the problems we're supposed to address.
We have a question from Stephanie. She's asking what your take is on the World Food Programme winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
I think I've said it when I've talked about food systems. I mean, the World Food Programme, a lot of its work is actually in emergency aid, in which it has a really difficult job because in recent years, the traditional donors have not been putting up the finance for the food aid that is needed. I think I don't particularly study the World Food Programme, so I don't want to really say that much about it. I don't think it's really so appropriate as a recipient of a peace prize because it gives credibility to an organization which is embedded within the UN system. And I think that is inherently a problem of the systems of power which are a consequence of the UN system being based around sovereign nation states. So I'm not going to say any more about that because I haven't actually, since it got the prize, I haven't actually looked at it in any detail to think more about it. So I'll keep that brief.
Next, we have the question, what can research institutes, think tanks do to avoid being trapped in this stream of, using the term that you used, bogus system?
I think we have, again, it's about being honest. It's about saying, okay, the word sustainable or sustainability was generated with meaning in if I remember rightly, 1989, I think in the original the report. But since then, everybody uses the word sustainable without defining what they mean. I think we actually have to take these words and go back to either getting rid of them, resilience is another one, transformation is another one. All these words have had meaning ripped out of them because they become useful to disguising why we need to have transformation.
Then, wow, we are getting a lot of questions for you. Is what is your take on aid for power within the context of political gain, especially when it pertains to less needy countries?
Sorry, what is my take on?
Aid for power within the context of political gain, especially when it pertains to less needy countries.
I'm not quite sure what the question means in terms of aid for power. Maybe that questioner could resend it with an clarify that for me. That would be useful. Ahmed, I can see it's your question. So if you could rephrase that so I know what you mean by aid for power, that would be very helpful. So do you want to come back and then take the next one, Hania?
Yes. The next is, my question is, with acknowledging that it's not a one-way binary from developed to developing and the importance of locality, do you personally think global models, either of oppressive modalities or solutions, have relevance?
I'm trying to think what might be meant there by a global model, but what I would argue is every instance of a problem has to be understood in its local context. So I think that it's vitally important to understand, for example, what is the cause of the oppression or poverty of people in a particular location, because then you would identify the systems of power that are relevant to that. So in recent years, I've done a bit of work in Bangladesh, and the work that is done there on whether it's adapting to climate change or disaster preparedness for cyclones, a lot of the work that's going on does not look at land tenure systems. And I think this is particularly difficult because in coastal Bangladesh, 80% of the rural households have either no land or very, very small land holdings. It's extremely difficult for them to adapt to climate change. It's extremely difficult for them to join in any disaster preparedness activities because the political economic system has allocated them no land or next to no land. That's not an accident. It's a function of the feudal or semi-feudal system, which is bringing benefits to the elite. So the problem of poverty and vulnerability in that particular context has to be very much understood in relation to that local political economy. So I think that is why I mentioned in my talk that I don't like using the idea that capitalism is the simple problem cause of all these problems. I think there are different systems of power in many different parts of the world locally, which are the ones that are most important. Gender oppression is not, in most of the world, gender oppression is not related to capitalism. And to understand it as a global model, I think, I'm not sure if that's what the questioner was meaning, but to understand all of the problems in the world as if they're generated because of the dominance of capitalism, whatever that means, I think is misleading. We need much more concrete analysis of the local political economy wherever the problem needs to be understood.
Thank you, Terry. There are lots of questions that are still coming in, but unfortunately we do have to move on.
Right.
Thank you for all of your questions, everyone. Maybe Terry will be willing to answer them over email if you drop him a line.
I'm very willing to do that. If people want to email a question, or I can print the chat box, I'll certainly help to do what I can to answer any more questions. So,
so
did we get Ahmed's back? If you're listening, Ahmed, on your question, just email me and I'll try to respond to it that way. So thank you for all your interest. I know it was challenging, and I hope it takes us somewhere useful. So thank you very much for the chance to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have our first student speaker. Ejiro Okotie is a 2019 Chevening Scholar and Master's holder in Development Studies, focusing on gender and sexuality. She sits on the board of the Pan-African Network of Youth with Disabilities and is a 2015 Mandela Washington Fellow of the Young Africa Leaders Initiative Program. Drawing from her personal experience as a woman with a disability, she scrutinizes adopted strategies for building back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, a key consideration for decision makers globally.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here. I grew up in Nigeria for almost the whole of my life, and losing my sight to meningitis at the age of 11 meant that I had to learn to live differently, be it from navigating an inaccessible environment as it related to infrastructure, the negative attitude or perceptions of individual, particularly regarding persons with disabilities, to issues around discrimination, and even acquiring an education was quite a difficult one for me. From all through my secondary school, which is high school, up to university, where I obtained my first degree, I used Braille, which are the 6 rays of dots that blind people use to read. I used that to take notes in class. And I also used a manual typewriter to write my examinations, which were verbally dictated to me. You can just imagine. But I surmounted all of those challenges. And for me, that was the world that I knew. until I came to the UK in 2019 to undergo a Master's in Development at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, where for the first time I had a different worldview to what inclusion was as related to education. I had a practical experience of accessibility because of the different reasonable accommodations that were made, provided for me. And that made learning so seamless. That made my study experience really amazing. That is not to say that my journey in the UK was, all a rosy ride. Of course, there are gaps in this society as well. And that brings me to the fact that if we are to have a conversation around building back better but different, we need to first understand what exists in the present system, what are the gaps, what are the cracks in the fabric of society. And by having an understanding of those issues, then it can provide a roadmap for us to begin to profile solutions to build back better. As such, I would like to talk about inclusion and access, drawing from my experience in my studies, in my work as a director of a non-profit in Nigeria, and also from my interaction in my environment as a person with a disability. I wish to raise awareness about inclusion and access. So a couple of months ago, I was walking through the University of Sussex with my friend, and she drew my attention to the footprint that they had put on the floor as an indication for social distancing, which are part of the measures for protecting students. And I thought to myself, how relevant was this strategy to me as a blind person? And let's even look beyond me. There are other people who may not be totally blind like me, but may have other side defects like short-sightedness or long-sightedness or whatever other eye defects that they may have that may not even be able to see those markings on the floor. Yes, a great idea and great strategy. But how about if whoever brought that idea thought about putting tactile markings on those prints, and they sensitize me as a blind person that if you place your feet, if you're walking on the road and you place your feet on these tactile markings, they are the markings that have been put as indications for social distancing, just like you have for road crossings across the UK. I think if whoever made the suggestion for that strategy was thinking inclusion and thinking access, he would have made this suggestion with tactile markings. Similarly, in the month of August this year, I was invited to attend a conference, and it was supposed to be hosted on a virtual island. And this island had a beach, it had the football pitch, it had so many recreational facilities fitted into it, and a huge different conference halls within the island. It was a really beautiful island. I'm sure you might be wondering, oh, she's blind. How did she know that it was a beautiful island? My friends gave me a vivid description about it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to participate in that event. It was a virtual event. I wasn't able to participate. Why? The island that had been built had no accessibility feature factored into it whatsoever. And that meant that my screen readers, be it the job access with speech that I use on my computer, which is JAWS, or the voiceover, which is on my iOS device, could not access the platform. And that, again, to me, is one of the gaps that we have, even as we're thinking about strategies for moving to virtual spaces and digital spaces. In addition, I reflected on the strategy that we have taken towards addressing the issue that regarding regarding education. Because of the pandemic, of course, we've had cuts in physical learning spaces, and we've had to move online. But have we paused to think about how many people, how many children, and how many persons across the world have access to remote learning tools like computers, internet, And even worse off, I think, is the case for children and persons with disabilities who may require additional assistive technology or learning aid to be able to effectively navigate those online platforms. So my question is, are we widening the gap of inequality that exists presently in the solutions that we're developing or designing in the post-COVID-19 or for building back better? Are we further deepening the exclusion that persons with disabilities face? And I think the answer to that question is that people are not thinking inclusion and people are not thinking access. And by inclusion here, I mean ensuring that everybody, regardless of disability, is considered in policies, in programs, in products and activities. And access is simply the gateway. So I would say inclusion and access are two sides of the same coin. So this is relevant, particularly in development, because we are mostly saddled with responsibility of designing and implementing programs. We conduct research and we're able to make policy recommendations to governments and to different organizational structures. So why is it necessary for us to raise awareness? I think awareness on inclusion is important. It is important for us to raise awareness and bring attention to issues of inclusion and access because it serves as the key to making a difference. Robert Chambers, who is a popular faculty at IDS, I must say one of my favorite, by the way, he said in his book, Whose Reality Counts, that for us as development professionals, we think the way that we think. We act the way that we act because we do not question things. And it's only in questioning things do we change. So it is important for us to begin to scrutinize these strategies and policies that we're putting out there, be it as it relates to remote working, be it as it relates to online learning in terms of education, as I've mentioned, and in technological innovations. And this also applies to us as individuals because in the last, owing to the pandemic, we have had an exponential increase in YouTubers, vloggers, and we have individuals developing and generating content for public consumption. I think it's important for us to pause and ask ourselves, who would benefit from what I have designed, from what I have developed? Who is able to consume? How many people in society will be able to consume the content that I have generated? And it's only in thinking this way that I feel that we will be thinking inclusion and thinking access, and we'll be able to question our actions, like Robert Chambers said in his book. From my experience, I would like to give 3 suggestions on how we can begin to think inclusion and access and how this can help to contribute to inclusive development. And for me, the first will be consultation and active involvement of persons with disabilities, be it in policy processes, in program design and implementation. Because as the mantra goes, nothing about us without us. And that is it. The voice of persons with disabilities need to be heard from the design stage of any project, because I always say after a project or program or policy has been designed, it's difficult to begin to bring adaptive measures because that's like medicine after death. So bringing their voices in from the design stage, it helps to ensure that the inclusive processes are put in place and the accessibility that is required is also adequately addressed. My second suggestion would also to be that to encourage a broad-based production, bearing in mind that persons with disabilities are different. Persons with disabilities are different and their peculiar needs vary from person to person. Lastly, I think it is important for us to have collaboration across different disciplines and cultural backgrounds. This is to encourage knowledge sharing and learning exchange, so that countries and organizations and individuals who are getting it right in terms of inclusion and access can share with others, can share good practices with others, and together we can build a world that is better for all. As Jesse Jackson said, Jesse Jackson, a writer, as he says, when everyone is included, everyone wins. So I say, if we are to build a world that is better for all, then we need to think inclusion and we need to think access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ejiro. That was incredibly inspiring and a topic that is often neglected. Again, as before, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A panel or in the chat box. We will be taking questions now. For everyone else who didn't get their questions answered previously by Terry, I am putting his email details in the chat box if you're still interested in getting your answers. So, Ejiro, if you can join me online.
Yeah, hi, I'm here.
Again, thank you so much. You had some strategies that, you had steps that you think that everyone needs to follow to increase inclusion and access. Are there any other examples that you could share with us of programs that are getting it right when it comes to this?
In terms of programs, like I said, I really think that I would give the example of my own organization working in Nigeria. So as the COVID-19 started, I mean, in Nigeria, basically, they had done a lot of palliatives, like providing food support for low-income families and all that. But for me as an individual, I kind of thought about the mental health impact of the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of persons with disabilities, particularly girls who I work with mostly. And as a result, I designed a mental health and psychosocial support program for girls with disabilities, which was supposed to run online because of the pandemic. And that was the first time we're having to do a program online. So it was quite challenging because now on this platform we had girls who were deaf, we had girls who were blind, we had girls physically challenged who are sighted obviously and would be able to read whatever format that you put. But we discovered that if you use just voice notes, which are quite easy to deliver messages, particularly if you're using WhatsApp in Nigeria, because of the high cost of broadband and all that, sometimes it's better to use platforms where you have low data usage like WhatsApp. So a lot of the sessions were organized on WhatsApp, right? And dropping voice notes on WhatsApp to facilitate a session might be a quicker way to do that. But when you do that, you're obviously excluding the deaf who cannot access voice notes. And when you use things like stickers, which is also a very quick way, like an infographic, to send a message across, sometimes it blocks the screen for the screen readers for the blind, and they cannot access that. So we found ourselves constantly reworking different strategies to kind of to adopt a strategy that would work for everybody. And I think one of the strategies that we finally settled for was using a text-based approach. So for every facilitator and for every activity that we did, we kind of restricted it to text because everybody could read text. And if you had to use graphics, then you also had to put a detailed description of it. So that's being deliberate. So I think the bottom line is in issues of inclusion and access, you really have to be deliberate. It's not something that you do like as an afterthought. That's like one of the key messages that I really want to pass across. And I think I mentioned that towards the end of my talk. And that's factor in when you're thinking inclusion from the design stage of your project, then you're able to address all of these limitations that you may experience. And as you get along, you are prepared, so it's easy for you to also be open to working up different strategies to ensure that your system, whatever you're bringing out, is accessible. So I think that's a practical example that I can give in terms of inclusion and access and what we have done, particularly regarding programs that we have done for responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's just a comment that I'm going to read that somebody has shared. Very powerful words. Bringing in adaptations measures after policy is prescribing medicine after death. Ejiro, you are so powerful in your words about access and inclusion. It was an eye-opener, especially how many of our solutions don't consider the aspect of inclusion. I was blown away by your example of the footprints for social distancing and distance learning about them not being inclusive. Are there any?
Thank you.
If nobody else has any questions or comments for Ejiro, we can take a break right now. We actually will be taking a 15-minute break before we get to the rest of our speakers. We have a great mix that's being created. Oh, never mind. I take that back. Someone has asked a question. Sorry, Ejiro. So the question is, oh man, a bunch of questions just came through. So a question has come through. Hello, Ejiro. I am a disabled self-advocate and researcher from the USA. I love what you said about access after a project is designed being like a medicine for the dead after death. Can you speak to how access and reasonable accommodations does not need to require expensive technology?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of inclusion and access not requiring expensive technology, I mean, I really think like if with proper research, you should be, there are lots of alternatives out there by which we can make our systems adaptive. I'll give an example. As a blind user of screen readers, right? You have the Job Access with Speech, which is a paid licensed screen reader, but you also have NVDA. I can't remember the full meaning, but you also have NVDA, which is free. So if, for instance, you have to kind of make your systems adaptable for a blind person and you're not able to afford JAWS, which equally does the same work that NVDA does, you could download NVDA for free and you have that to use. So this is just like one example at the top of my head. And I know that there are 8,001 technologies that are free that we could actually leverage on to make our systems inclusive and accessible for the different disability groups that we work with. Thank you.
Someone is asking if there's any group or community of persons with disabilities that development practitioners can reach out to as they design programs in order to help know how their needs need to be considered.
Yeah, so I think within every country or community, you would have organizations of persons with disabilities. You would have the organization of persons with disabilities, which basically comprise of persons with disabilities themselves. And you probably would also have organizations who are working for persons with disabilities. And it's just to kind of do a research on the region that you are and the organizations that are working in that region and reach out to them, because I always say it's important to have the voice of a person with a disability, because for you, you might be the expert, you might have all the knowledge, but that first-hand experience that person living with the disability brings to the table makes the whole difference. So it's always important to always have them as part of your design process, design process basically. Yeah, so I believe that my answer to that question would be that there are in different parts of the world and in different communities, is just to do a research, probably online, to check for the organizations that function around the region where you are, and I'm sure you find someone to reach out to. And you have the International Disability Alliance, which is a big organization of persons with disabilities, and that works for persons with disabilities as well. For the blind, you have the World Blind Union, and there are a lot of other like really big international and regional, as well as national and local organizations working for people with disabilities.
Thank you. I think I will take one more question. There are quite a few of them. Hopefully, maybe Ejiro, if you don't mind, people can contact you and you can address them later.
Yeah, that would be great. Yes, I'm happy to do that.
So the next question is, how is your experience being shared with others who have had similar issues in their programs? Are there areas online where we can access these learnings?
Yeah, so as much as I can, in my organization, we usually have reports of programs online, and I'm also really open to engaging with people at different levels, depending on what programs or policies or projects that they are working on. I'm happy to be reached to consult, to work with them on that. And like I said, I have a lot of that on our website. I think I put my my organizational website and our social media handles in. I can just put that in the chat box if that's fine. And yeah, people can obviously also send me emails if they need like additional information and stuff.
Yes, that would be great. I think we should, we'll move on. We're going to take a break. I know there were a lot more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Ejiro's details in the chat, so you can get in touch with her. Thank you so much for your talk. And we're going to move on. As I was saying,
thank you for having me as well.
Thank you. So as I was saying earlier, we'll now be taking a 15-minute break before we get to the rest of our speakers. We have a great mix that's been created by our resident student DJ Graham just for the event. So please check it out.
Voz de las montañas, voz de las cascadas, agüita cristalina, fluye y fluye. Voz de las fluye, fluye, fluye.
Agua de la tierra me quieren quitar los dueños del mundo, los siervos del mal, el oro de este siglo, la luz de los valles, que mueran esos ríos, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce. Sagrada, prisionera del diablo, te quiero ver corriendo por el cerro bajando, germinando semillas, floreciendo esperanza en manos de la vida, no del que la amenaza, no del que la amenaza, no del que la amenaza.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that great mix by Graham. Thank you so much for putting it together. Our next student speaker, Sahara Basnet, is a development practitioner with 5 years of professional experience in program management, research and data analysis, and communications on topics related to gender and WASH, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene. In her talk, she analyzes different WASH campaigns and delves deeper into the triggers and language used to achieve the campaign objectives with a key question in mind. What happens to gender roles and relations, especially when it comes to building back better, but different?
When talking about building back better but different, it is essential to reflect on what we have been doing so far. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted just how vital water, sanitation, and hygiene is for us humans. The water, sanitation, and hygiene sector, also known as the WASH sector, not only holds the potential to reduce diseases that plague humankind, but they also hold the ability to shift gender dynamics in a society significantly. And this is mainly because roles around WASH tend to be highly gendered. It comes as no surprise to us that women tend to be the household managers in charge of all WASH-related needs. Such is the case mostly in rural areas where the burden of all WASH activities of the family falls solely on women. Women's socially prescribed gender roles around WASH, such as fetching water, cleaning sanitation facilities, maintaining the hygiene of family and household, all of these fall under the unpaid care work being done by them every single day. According to the UN, women spend 3 times as many hours as men doing unpaid care work. This means that majority of the unpaid care work around the house is being done by women, if not all of it is done by women. So, given the fact that women tend to hold majority of the roles around WASH, it only makes sense that they are chosen as the primary target for any WASH interventions. After all, if you want to see behavior change around WASH, you have to target the ones who are responsible for such behaviors in the first place. But when does making women sole target of such interventions go wrong? Well, to understand that, first we must understand how WASH campaigns work. Well, interventions around WASH require certain triggering of emotions to create specific behavior change. Campaigns tend to rely on triggering certain emotions of their audiences, amongst their audiences, so that they adopt proper sanitation behaviors. For example, community-led total sanitation, also known as CLTS, is an approach where they rely on shock, disgust, and shame as triggering factors to create desired sanitation behaviors. For example, they do this by making the participants realize that by defecating in the open, they are basically ingesting each other's feces. Yes, sanitation WASH campaigns can get really dirty. But CLTS is not what I want to talk about today. This was just an example of how triggering works to make participants or audiences adopt improved sanitation behavior or WASH-related behaviors. So my main concern today is to understand the kind of triggers that are being used by some of the WASH campaigns and what messages these triggers could be giving out. So let's look at some of the WASH campaigns that have taken place recently. So this is a sanitation campaign in South India called Super Amma, which means super mother when translated into English from Hindi. This campaign recognized nurture as a motivational or a trigger factor to create behavior change. So the woman in this picture is a fictional character called Super Amma, and she is meant to be an aspirational figure for rural Indian mothers. In this picture, Super Amma is a mother who teaches her son the importance of hand washing with soap as a part of good manners, and as a result, the son becomes a very successful young man. Here is another hand wash campaign by Oxfam called Mom's Magic Hands, which took place in the Philippines, Pakistan, and Nepal. In this campaign, emotion and health were recognized as a trigger factor. The message of this campaign was that mothers nurture their kids against all odds. Their magic hands care for the children. Thus, washing those magic hands can prevent their children from getting ill. So, as you can see in this picture, the mother's good habit of washing her hands with soap inspired her daughter to grow up to become very successful. And finally, here is an example of another sanitation campaign, hand wash campaign by Lifebuoy called Help a Child Reach 5. This took place in India and Kenya. And in this campaign, emotion was recognized as a trigger factor to create behavior change. So, in this campaign, expecting mothers were shown videos of their future daughter at the age of 7, where the daughters thanked their mothers for adopting good sanitation and hygiene habits by washing their hands while the children were little. And the mother's use of such good habits enabled the child to grow up and become who they are today, that they can see on the TV. And that is basically how this video experiment encouraged expecting mothers to adopt hand washing with soap habits, so that their children can live up to the age of 5 and beyond. This experiment was conducted both in India and Kenya. So, what do all of these campaigns have in common? Yes, all of these campaigns do reflect the importance of hand washing with soap, but these campaigns talk about something else as well. Super Amma, Mom's Magic Hands, and Help a Child Reach 5. All of these campaigns reflect the idea of what it means to be a good mother. In all three campaigns, the idea of the ideal mother was represented in order to convince the audience, in order to convince other women to adopt the proper sanitation habits of washing their hands with soap. All the while, the presence of a father figure or any male caregiver for that matter was largely absent. In all three campaigns, women were targeted solely for the intervention. And these are just a few examples of many other campaigns that rely on this kind of communication strategy. This is a problem. Although these campaigns may have been able to create positive behavior change and reach their end goal, these interventions either knowingly or unknowingly drive the narrative of what it means to be a good mother, and that a good mother is the one who is responsible for her family's improved hygiene practices, and that the hygiene responsibility of a child is solely women's work. Imagine the impact of these campaigns that go into communities and into countries and communities that have such patriarchal gender roles and relations that women tend to do majority of the unpaid care work because society deems it so. And campaigns that are national or international coming into these scenarios and then reinstating those cultural stereotypes, the impact of that can be detrimental, because these campaigns inadvertently fuel the gender and cultural stereotype of what it means, of what a woman's work means, and that it is solely a woman's job to make sure her child is successful and healthy. Although seeking to create positive behavior change, these campaigns can end up inadvertently fueling gender stereotypes and further burdening women who already bear the brunt of unpaid care work, subject them to gender stereotypes, and also limit their abilities to challenge patriarchal gender roles and relations. WASH sectors hold immense potential to improve the state of women and girls. WASH campaigns improve access to resources that enable women to avoid violence, improve their literacy, pursue financial independence, among others. But WASH campaigns can be so much more than that. WASH campaigns can be a pathway to empowerment and realizing gender equality for women and girls. Simply increasing access to resources is not enough if we want to uplift the status of women, especially in marginalized communities. These things will not work as long as we directly or indirectly relate all WASH activities as women's domain and increase the burden of unpaid care work. My message today is simple. I do not insinuate in any way, shape, or form that these campaigns are ineffective or that these campaigns should not target women for interventions. As I stated in the beginning of this talk, as primary caregivers or resource users, they need to be targeted in order to create the behavior change that's necessary for the WASH campaigns to be successful. However, we also need to reflect on the potential downside of such campaigns that focus on gender-specific target and use gender stereotypes as trigger points for change. So, the next time we see a sanitation campaign, we need to think to ourselves, what are the underlying assumptions that these campaigns are trying to reflect? And we should also ask ourselves this. In the name of replicating cultural realities of the places we are trying to give intervention to, are we feeding into the gender stereotypes and making those stereotypes stronger? In the name of promoting human health, are we also harming gender roles and relations? As the discourse around WASH is at an all-time high due to COVID-19 and many WASH campaigns are emerging, it is essential now more than ever to reflect on what we have been doing so far. All WASH campaigns need to be gender transformative without losing their impact and effectiveness. This means that they need to promote shared responsibility within households in all the campaigns that they do, because even in campaigns that solely focus on health, for example, the campaigns I spoke about above, where their main aim is to talk about the health of a child, these campaigns also indirectly reflect gender roles and relations. So, if we are to ever see a gender equal future post-pandemic, post-COVID, we must understand the fine line between targeting women as primary users of resources versus targeting women and reinforcing gender stereotype of what a woman's work entails. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahara. It was extremely fascinating, particularly considering the importance of WASH as a consideration of the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic. I see that you're online right now as well. Thank you so much for joining us from Nepal. I know it's very late over there right now, so we definitely appreciate you coming online at this time. As I said earlier, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat box. We will, I will ask Sahara and we will address some of these questions. I'd like to start first by commending you on some of those really interesting examples, but also asking you if there were any campaigns that you've come across in WASH that doesn't reinforce gender stereotypes.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And yes, there are some campaigns that I have come across that are trying to move away from certain stereotypes, but I've not seen them in extremely massive scale. And I have seen certain campaigns that are trying to not reinforce toilets as women's domain, or sanitation facilities or wash-related activities as women's domain. But again, these things also need to be done in a very strategic way, because there are certain campaigns that have tried to show that, it is, sanitation facility, for example, is not a women's domain. So they have tried to encourage men to use toilets. But in that sense, they have said that if you, it's an example of a sanitation campaign in where they said that if you're man enough, then you need to make your wife and children use the toilets. And again, those things can be problematic too, because again, we don't want it to go too much towards essentialist ideas of gender roles and relations, because some sanitation campaigns that may be trying to move away from increasing burden for women also end up, reflecting on the power dynamics, the patriarchal power dynamics that have existed for a very long time.
Thank you. Also, do you have any advice for, how to start a conversation with a campaign developer, to ensure that they're designing gender transformative programs?
Yes, I think the first step is just to realize. For me, I also have a sanitation wash intervention organization called ASHA in Nepal. And initially for me, this is also something that I really it's something that I never really reflected on until I came to IDS and I started thinking more and questioning everything. And at that point, I think it just starts with people. I think the first step is to look at those campaigns and advertisement as if they were targeted towards you. Because when I started to look at campaigns that, target a lot of things that are as women's domain, I reflected as a woman who lives in a city. And for me, if I was a mother and if campaigns that come into my house and they just reinforce those kind of norms that it is my job solely. And I think thinking of it from a personal level is always the best idea to move forward when it comes to reflecting on campaigns and how they should actually be.
Thank you. I'm just going to read I think it was a comment on YouTube for you that says, well done, this was very informative and I loved what you pointed out. The next question I have for you is, playing devil's advocate here, these wash campaigns seem to reflect that societies they are being promoted in. Are you suggesting that wash campaigns be a vehicle for propaganda? I'm just not sure these campaigns should be a vehicle to promote any agenda, whether it's good or bad.
I feel like I think it's a fine line between being a propaganda and having certain agendas, because I don't believe that any campaigns that go into certain communities, they do have an agenda to achieve. They do want to see certain changes. Like every campaign, especially wash related, it is so close to behaviors of individuals that you are trying to create change within people. So of course, in my personal view, every campaign as such does have an agenda. And I think if we are to see a more gender equal future, like I said, in the end, we have to see if we want to create a change that is long lasting and bigger. And from that, if you want to create a ripple effect of other changes that further enhances the lives of people in those communities, we have to rethink certain strategies. And the reason I actually ended up using this, I ended up selecting this talk is because in Nepal, at least in the case of Nepal, when I have gone into certain communities for interventions, there is a power dynamic. So people do tend to listen to you. They do treat you like someone who's come and they're educated, and they kind of treat you they hold you in a certain position. And I think going in there, we already have a certain degree of power. So when we kind of reinstall certain ideals that are already somewhat problematic, it can be an issue, because in some of the campaigns that I read as well, in the examples that I gave, it was mentioned how women do unpaid care work all the time. So within the 12 hours of the day, they only had 2 hours free, and they chose those 2 hours to do these campaigns. And of course, like I mentioned in the talk, it is necessary to target the ones who are doing those behaviors to create that behavior change. But then again, just reflecting on the fact that if you spend 10 hours doing every other work, and in your 2 hours also, it's re-reminded to you that it is only your work, I think that can get problematic. And I feel like if unpaid care work is to be ever recognized, and if unpaid care work is to be ever balanced between men and women, WASH campaigns, these campaigns that talk about resources and a lot of unpaid care work being done in houses, they need to actually reflect that it is not just a gendered work. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question. There is a sense that the more resourceful or the more powerful are the ones who design and execute these campaigners. Thinking of what Terry mentioned about the world being the way it is because those in power want it to be this way, is there a way to break from this loop and actually empower people?
Well, that is a tricky question. I think, like I said, again, the reason I think this talk is very essential now and in this platform is because a lot of us are either already a development practitioner or we are, seeking to become one. So I think early on, if we start to realize that, yes, certain messaging can be taken a certain way, and maybe there can be a better ways of doing that, then perhaps, it will reach to the people of power. Maybe we can make it a norm. Maybe later in life, because for example, for me also, the WASH intervention work that I do through my organization, it may be a small scale work, but eventually, things get noticed. And with WASH activity, especially, like the things that end up working, papers are written about it and people start reading up about it, and that's how people adopt certain sanitation practices. So again, it is difficult and it is hard to go to big organizations and challenge them to work differently, because again, this is much easier. Not touching gender roles and relations is so much easier than actually trying to work on the power dynamics. But I think at some point, if we actually do want to see a gender equal future, it is essential to touch these things as well.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on. If you don't mind putting the details of your, if anyone has any other questions, they can get in touch with you, and of your organization. I'm sure people would love to hear more about it. Yeah, so we're going to move on to the final talk of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
The final talk of the day is by Dr. Jody Aked. She's the director of an innovative startup, Friday Pulse, and holds a PhD from IDS in development studies. She's worked across a varied portfolio of clients, indigenous communities, NGOs, UN agencies, and global corporates to design rewarding and accountable processes that help networks of people achieve their objectives. In her talk, Jody unravels whether it is possible to disclose impact within globally distributed supply chains. Can the world of business and work be humanized to build back better but different?
Thank you for inviting me to speak today about supply chains. I hope this is a beginning of a conversation we can continue to have about how to build supply chains differently in a post-COVID world. When I refer to supply chains, I'm talking about people, the farmers, the producers, the processors, the designers, the manufacturers and distributors who get products to our homes and to our shops. As we entered lockdown in March of this year, I, like many parents, was faced with trying to explain to my 5- and 2-year-old the implications of the coronavirus on our way of life. I found my way to a book called The World Comes to My Place Today. It's about a boy called George whose sister has chickenpox, and George can't leave the house because he might be infectious too. You see the similarities. In this joyous tale, Grandad helps George cope with boredom and his increasing sense of isolation by noticing his interdependence. Room by room, item by item, toothbrush, bread, chocolate, coffee, they explore where in the world it has come from. And the book reminded me of the New Economics Foundation's interdependence reports in the mid to late 2000s. Through mapping where the things we buy in the UK come from, it showed we are hyper-connected to the world and in fact reliant on it to sustain our way of life. We sort of know this. We occasionally check labels to see where things are made. But the details of supply chain, who does what when, are largely mysterious to us, and perhaps intentionally so. But in 2020, COVID happened, and our interdependence and the inequity in it was totally laid bare. Changing consumption patterns in countries like the UK caused supply chains to collapse. When people stopped consuming, lead firms and supply chains cancelled their orders. News outlets started reporting things like 40 million garment workers, 40 million in the fashion industry were plunged into immediate destitution when contracts were cancelled and jobs were lost. Put simply, cancelled contracts means no work, which means no income, which means no food to eat. Researchers found that there's been a 70% drop in income among the urban poor and people living in urban slums. IDS's Action Research Programme on the worst forms of child labour, I think it's called Clarissa, found the leather sector in Dhaka in Bangladesh closed most of its leather processing factories. And this left around 25,000 tannery workers at the bottom of the supply chain in great despair about their lives. The emerging evidence is directly implicating decisions that are made in supply chains to Sustainable Development Goal 1 for no poverty, SDG 2 for zero hunger, SDG 10 for reduced inequalities, and SDG 3 for health and well-being. And at this point I'm wondering how the world came to my place today might be written for a child at the other end of the supply chain to George. Say the child of a Bangladeshi textile worker who just lost their job and who hasn't had enough food to eat today. I wonder if the tale would be more cautionary in tone than a joyous celebration of human connectivity. So I think of COVID as a reckoning for global supply chains, a stress test, and they failed millions of people. But they didn't have to. So consumer goods company Unilever placed 500 million euros on the balance sheet to make early repayments to suppliers, particularly small suppliers, so that they could stay in business. Another UK company, the coffee and tea company Betty's and Taylor's, committed to honouring all their long-term contracts, accelerating the flow of money to suppliers where needed, and they opened up credit lines to growers and social lenders. The action Unilever and Betty's and Taylor's took to anchor their supply chains for greater resiliency and sustainability reminded me of the role of anchor institutions in local economies. Traditionally, anchor institutions have been not-for-profit organisations. They're place-based institutions like universities, healthcare trusts, housing associations with large purchasing power. They are able to pool their commissioning and their procurement budgets to irrigate investment into local communities and keep it circulating so it doesn't trickle out. Now, how do we get more companies like Betty's and Taylor's and Unilever acting like anchor institutions in their supply chains? Well, I thought we could mandate that they do, but free market economics might have something to say about that. Now, the reason corporates haven't historically acted as anchor institutions is that they don't have what we call sticky capital, a connection to a place, which means they cannot easily move operations to another location which seems more financially viable. So airports and football clubs are famous exceptions. So what can we learn from Betty's and Taylor's and Unilever, which other organisations can adopt? Well, when you read about why Betty's and Taylor's used their leadership role within their supply chain to provide security to stakeholders, they refer back to their family business constitution. And this constitution recognises their business does not stand alone. And when you hear Alan Jope, the current CEO of Unilever, speaking, he explains the company's focus on an integrated approach to sustainability echoes the goals of its founders, who in 1870 wanted to be a force for good and to lessen the load of women who bore the brunt of household chores in 1870. But when workers went off to fight in the First World War, they kept people's jobs open and they continued paying wages to their families while they were away from home. So when you look at these two, at first glance, we notice they are both purpose-driven organisations. They sort of have purpose in their soul, which is both heartening and disappointing at the same time, because it takes a long time to shift mindsets in less purpose-driven businesses. And we know that two examples does not a pattern make, they are outliers. But when you look and listen again, you can see what they know to be true, that their own companies are part of an interconnected whole, that company revenue benefits from that interconnectivity, and the decisions key companies make in supply chains impact millions of people's lives deeply. And it's this acknowledgement and this disclosure of impact to their shareholders, to their customers, to each other across the table in the boardroom, which is what created the need for active leadership in their supply chains. So once we realise this, the question or the challenge then becomes, how do we get more investors, more customers, more senior executives aware of the human impact of their decisions in supply chains? And my suggestion is that we make the invisible visible. In my current role at Friday Pulse, I've been working with a very innovative statistician, Nick Marks, to radically change the ways organisations monitor wellbeing week to week, quarter to quarter. Here is an example of a heat map that one of our clients might see. Across the top, at the left-hand side, they can see how happy people are, which is our ultimate measure of impact. And all the other columns to the right measure key drivers of a positive employee experience. So the balance of time people spend at work versus other aspects of their lives, the extent to which they feel they can influence decisions in their work, and the quality of their relationships at work. Down the side, we have every team, every division, every team, every sub-team listed. And we ask people about their subjective experiences, about how they feel, and we convert answers on a 1 to 100 scale. And this scale is colour-coded from red to green. So at a glance, a senior leader or a HR business partner can see where things are going well and where things aren't. They can see the diversity of experience that exists within their workforce, and they can see where to focus their energies and efforts to improve things. By bringing people's experiences to the foreground, we are shifting the nature of conversations in businesses. We are changing the focus and we're changing the concerns of companies all over the world. We are making workplaces, even globally distributed workforces of 10,000 people, more human. And it's not hard to imagine that we can use digital platforms to account for diversity of experiences in supply chains. We can organise impact data according to key actors in the supply chain, like women, even children. We can use sampling methods to capture the experiences of actors in the informal sector, the informal economy that sits around supply chains, so their experiences can also be included. Fundamentally, I believe getting supply chains to acknowledge and disclose their human impact is a sweet intervention point, because it creates amplifying feedbacks across our financial and our legal sectors. Where impact reporting is strengthening around climate change, for example, we see the creation of league tables and scorecards that highlight the best and the worst performing companies. These legal tables work as a behavioural intervention because no one wants to be at the bottom, just as no CEO wants to see red scores on the Friday platform in the businesses they lead. Where we have impact reporting, we organise pension packages which invest in those companies that are promoting and positively contribute towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Where we have impact reporting, we amplify how the rule of law can be used to protect worker rights and human rights. All these ripple effects celebrate and reinforce the actions of companies like Unilever and Betty's and Taylor's to anchor their supply chains, and they provide the impetus for other companies to follow suit. Just to conclude, I have been working in and around supply chains now for 10 years, and this feels like the first time that the existence of supply chains as discrete socioeconomic entities has truly lodged itself in our collective consciousness, which is why the time is now. Supply chains have become superstructures that affect all our lives and the future that we want. In the intervening years, while waiting for this to happen, I've learned a lot from the way Indigenous people organise their food systems. They have invested in their relational systems to form a social safety net. For agriculturalists in northeast India, this looks like exchanges of time, exchanges of seeds and the proceeds of harvest, so that if one family's crop fails, they're not left destitute. For nomadic pastoralists in Kenya, their animals are their family. They treat them like that. They are extensions of them and their way of life. True sustainability and resilience, they have taught me, is not about organising the world so we can go on living as we currently do in countries like the UK. It's about equal and reciprocal relationships between people and institutions, and between people and the natural environment. It's about providing economic and social security like Betty's and Taylor's and Unilever have done. It's about me looking after you and you looking after me. It's about what we invest in each other as well as what we enjoy from each other. At the end of The World Came to My Place today, George goes to bed, clutching his globe and happy and reassured by his new sense of connectedness. I'd like to go to bed tonight, thinking that George will wake up tomorrow or maybe the next day, but hopefully one day before his sister's virus clears up. And he says, "Grandad, that's all well and good, but how should I go to the world today?"
Thank you so much, Jody. If COVID-19 showed us anything, is that we have to rethink our current global supply chains. So thank you so much for putting that together for us. And as I said before to everyone, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will get to them. I would like to start by asking you a question of my own. You said that consumers benefit from making smarter choices, and are demanding that companies make smarter choices as well. How do you see, it can be quite overwhelming to see like big companies not do better and be good. Like, how do you see the power of consumers playing in this?
Yeah, so I think almost doing what George did and go item by item and start looking at the ethical and environmental credentials of the item that you're buying. And don't do it in an overwhelming way, just little by little, because if we're all making different choices little by little, that adds up to something. I was just listening to a podcast with it's got the senior executive of BP on it, because they've just come out with their new strategy. The podcast Outrage and Optimism, it's a really good one, and they've just got their strategy come out, and they want to sort of get an integrated energy company, and they're moving away from oil and gas. And he says, well, what I realized when I took over the company is that people still need our product, the oil and gas, but they don't particularly want it anymore. And I think that you've got massive companies that their whole identity has been that they are an oil and gas extractor, saying we're going to do something different and we're going to divest in that and we're going to invest in renewables, and their share prices go up. That's because the market knows that consumers, us, are starting to shift, and we're starting to shift dramatically in terms of what we expect out of companies. And the more companies that we see out there, I stumbled into one just yesterday, Cotopaxi, that does outdoor gear that has a social impact statement on their website. Like, there were more and more of these companies coming along. So I think there are individual choices, and then I think the other big one is pensions. Pensions, I mean, we're talking massive sums of money. And, I've got frustrated because I've, for example, boycotted certain brands my entire life, well, for like 20 years, like Nestle. I just don't buy from them. And my children aren't allowed Nestle ice creams and things like that. But it doesn't feel like Nestle have diminished in their power much in the last 20 years because of my singular action. But pension funds is we're playing at a totally different level of the system. We're talking about massive financial investments, and there are now pension funds out there that aren't just looking at minimizing harm. They're looking at actively promoting through their investments the SDGs. So checking where your pensions are. If you're not quite working yet, but you're going to be working, holding companies to account to say, I want a pension that creates positive impact. Then we start to shift some big players in our, if you like, consumer sector, but that's often one that goes hidden. Like, we don't really think about it. We just get a job and we go, oh, great, it's got a pension package. But actually, if enough of us are starting to demand differently from our pensions, that could have a massive impact, I think.
Thank you. Also, next question. When you talked about taking care of me and taking care of you, and as we've seen with COVID, it is all about collective responsibility and shared living. How do you see this being incorporated at a macro level?
What being incorporated at a macro level?
The collective responsibility, right? Because I think COVID has shown that you can't really point fingers at different, like, oh, it's their responsibility, because you're going to have a complete breakdown of systems. So how do you see this collective responsibility being kind of incorporated at a macro level?
I'll answer a little bit and then you can advise me as whether I've got the crux of the question right. But transparency and this kind of disclosure of impact and that reporting is a big deal, and digital platforms can help with this, because this is no longer information that's held in a certain part of the supply chain or a certain part of a company. It is accessible and visible to all. So the wonderful thing about data and technology is it allows us to protect people's responses, so people can trust in the system that they can answer honestly and not get exposed, which is not so easy to do with standard sort of social research methods. So it guarantees that anonymity, but then it also allows us to make data available to everyone. So, for example, I mean, this is a microcosm, this is not a whole supply chain, but in the tool that I have now, it's designed so that I will see my results and I'm the only person who will see my scores. But I will also see my team's scores and my organisation scores, so the whole organisation. So I could be sat in an organisation of 10,000 people and I will see how things are doing across at the whole organisational level. And that transparency sort of holds people to account for one another, because then the knowledge is out there and it's shared and we can see where we're doing well and we can see where we're not doing well. And that kind of shifts people's mindset somewhat into thinking, well, this is something that we all have to be a part of. And I think that when you get to sectors like the climate change impact stuff, people just create rankings and things like that. And so it really encourages people to step up.
I think that was good. I think that probably answered the question. The next one is, what will it take to turn these supply chains into chains of transformation to an economy of nurturance and well-being, universal but not uniform social protection?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a lot, but it's like it's going to take a lot. So like what I've presented today is not a panacea, it's one part of the picture. And the picture is complex, and it really is a picture that we don't know lots and lots about. So the Clarissa program at IDS that I've been talking to a bit in the last couple of weeks, we're looking at the worst forms of child labour on that program, and they mostly don't happen, it seems, in the the global supply chains with the big corporates. That happens in informal sectors. It happens in SME, like small medium enterprises within urban contexts. And so it's just that, but we don't know children's pathways through these supply chains, that we're not making any of this stuff visible. When I make a purchase, I don't understand that it's gone through 45 steps of manufacturing, from the raw material to what I buy, who's been involved, what kind of working conditions they've been subject to, whether they should have been working in the first place. So it's a big job to make this stuff visible, but I don't think it's impossible. I think it's an easy decision to make. It's hard to implement, and we need some of the best minds on it. And it's about, that's one aspect. Transparency is one aspect of governance, right? If we go to what good governance looks like, when we look at like ecosystems management and the environment, which these supply chains are a part of, it is multi-stakeholder participation. It's also social justice at its core. It's having trust. It's facilitating cross-scale learning across lots of people. So there are lots of aspects of getting supply chains governed well. And it's just finding those sweet intervention points to kick the system in the right direction, because what we don't want is to know that they failed us as badly as they have, or to fail other human beings as badly as they have, and we just rebuild them in the same way.
Thank you. There are a lot more questions, but I'm just going to take one final one, and then potentially ask you to give your details if people want to get in touch with you directly. The question is, your talk reminded me of a documentary by Al Jazeera on child labor in the Ivory Coast and its linkages to the chocolate industry. Do you think that journalism, mass media can potentially help in raising awareness amongst the general public about the complexity of supply chains and how different groups of people are marginalized?
Yeah, I think that it can. I think that there are some news outlets that have been doing quite a bit on supply chains and business and sustainability and the impact of COVID. And this is one of the interesting things about the timing of this, and that I just felt like I was sat there and in the pandemic and COVID, and it was just like news item after news item that was coming through about the impact on supply chains. And it didn't matter if it was coming out of Asia, Latin America, news outlets in the UK. It just suddenly seemed to be getting a lot more bandwidth. And I think that how I end my talk is I don't think we've really understood them as these socioeconomic structures that exist. We sort of think they sort of float around, but they are place-based. Every supply chain has, exists in a number of places, and where that particular factory is, or that processing plant, or the coffee growers, or the cacao farms, wherever they are, is a neighborhood and a local economy, and often an informal sector that grows on around that supply chain. So they don't float. They're not like, they are grounded. And because they're grounded in our economy, in our local economies, in our neighborhoods and our lives, they impact us deeply. So I think it's about showing that. It's about making some of this invisible a lot more visible. And I think it would be really helpful if this was just something we knew more about, and we had an engagement with it, and we researched it more as well. As a socioeconomic structure, we're in an unfortunate place, going back to the earlier question about, how much is it going to take to shift this into something that is more human and is about well-being for all. I feel like we have kind of drifted into it, and they've become so big sometimes now, and so not well understood. There just needs to be a lot of effort and focus and understanding, and then understanding how we can improve them. So I do think about like journalism and things like that, but I also think about people doing research. If you're interested in economics, and you're interested, this is an area of analysis or a focus of attention that we should be giving.
Thank you so much. I think that was like real food for thought for everyone who's joined us today. Again, thank you, Jody, so much for joining us and giving us such an insightful talk. To everyone else, I thank you for joining us. I'd like to now hand over to my co-lead, Alfred, to leave us with a few closing thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you, Hania. I am Alfred Ajaben, organizer of TEDxIDS. I studied governance, development, and public policy at IDS. Let me use this opportunity to thank Terry for reminding us about the role systems of power play in decolonizing aid and development. Thank you, Ejiro. Inclusion and access must be a priority when building back better. Sahara reminded us about how WASH sector is essential for the reduction of diseases and for shifting societal gender dynamics. Thank you, Jody. You reminded us about the role that supply chain play as a good force in helping us build better. We thank our amazing speakers for sharing these ideas on how we can build better post-COVID-19. TEDxIDS is a dream come true. Before I express my gratitude to the highly talented and hardworking IDS students who made this possible, let me say this. Earlier this year, while the world was still trying to figure out the extent to which the impact of COVID has gone, I reached out to my colleague Hania to partner me organize what has now become the first TEDx event at IDS. The goal, as we agreed, was to enable IDS students' voices in the post-COVID-19 conversation. We recruited the best and talented college students at IDS to join our team. Curtis, Ikuya, Clara, Elliot, Sama, Gillian, and Prachi are members of this exceptional committee that put this together. We also received extra support from Isita for the graphics and Graham for the music mix that we enjoyed. IDS faculty and staff provided immense support. We thank Director Melissa, Linda, Sarah, Gary, and James for their support. Last but not the least, we want to use this opportunity to thank you, our audience, for your attendance. Thank you very much. Hania?
Again, thank you all for joining us today. This wouldn't have been possible without our amazing committee who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes. Again, thank you to all the speakers and to any of the IDS students out there. If you are interested in being next year's organizers, please email us at TEDx@ids.ac.uk. I'll put the details in the chat. And thank you for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening.